Hey everyone, I'm Alicia McClintic here with my co-host Benjamin Cremer, and we are the A Plain Account podcast team, in case you didn't know. This is what episode are we?
We are on episode 141.
141. And we are heading into Holy Week and Easter. So before we open the scriptures today and look at the lection for Easter Sunday, we want to talk a little bit about the important moments leading up to that point in the story. We know that not everyone has Holy Week services, so everyone who's listening to the podcast might not be preaching or participating in something like Maundy Thursday or Good Friday or even a Holy Saturday Easter Vigil. But there are some folks who might be curious about that or might be planning to facilitate some kind of reflection for their communities. So Ben, what should we be thinking about or talking about or preparing for as we step into this next week, this Holy Week?
That's an excellent question. One I've been kind of asking myself all of Lent. I've really seen Maundy Thursday and Good Friday as opportunities to go beyond our immediate congregation. And so Maundy Thursday will be combining our services with Anglican church right down the street. So we'll be washing each other's feet on Thursday and trying to see that this commission, Maundy meaning commission, is sending us out to be around the table with friends. And so how are we doing that with not just those in our own circle who we're comfortable with, but how are we coming together with that? And then on Good Friday, we're going to a sister Nazarene church in the area, and just reading through the Passion account and blowing out. We set up all these candles in the sanctuary, and after a bit of the narrative is read, candles are extinguished until the Christ candle alone is extinguished.
And so a tenebrae service.
Yeah. So
Lovely.
and then we exit in silence, awaiting what happens on Sunday. And so at least in my context, we're looking at how we can engage with Christian brothers and sisters that we don't normally engage with on a regular basis, and then how are we really finding who we are in the Passion narrative, like what characters do we resonate with, who do we feel like we are the secret things that we have hidden in our hearts, how are they brought to light by the suffering of our Savior. And so really walking with Jesus to the cross so that we can understand the depth of the resurrection. What sort of things would you recommend we reflect on this season?
Yeah, I really love that. I wish that my community were at a place where we could gather together to celebrate Maundy Thursday or Good Friday, but for a variety of reasons, we don't have anything planned as a community in terms of gathering. But I've tried to put together some reflection questions and some content for folks to read and to think about and to pray through along similar lines, like remembering Jesus's life, his commands to his disciples to love one another, to serve one another, and to lead us into Easter Sunday with contemplation and reflection, really slowing down to take in these last moments of Jesus's life and to find ourselves in the story.
Wow, that's really good. I need to get better at writing things for my people.
Yeah. So I'm hopeful that that's a good place for us to start. And on this past Sunday, we did like a bit of the Palm Sunday liturgy and a bit of the Passion liturgy, knowing that I won't see them this week, like at least for a formal service or a formal gathering. So we tried to kind of cover both of those pieces of the liturgy. And that seems to work for us okay.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah. Also, I would like this week is a great space for me as a pastor, since I don't have anything particularly planned for my community. It's great for me to participate in some other things happening across the area. So the church I used to work for, the community I used to serve, hosts a Good Friday community gathering, so it'll be sweet to worship with them. It's a chance to come home to them in some
Mhm.
ways, um, and yeah, and to worship with a community that doesn't that loves me as a pastor, but isn't expecting me to carry the responsibilities of a pastor.
Yeah.
So that's really sweet. And then my aunt and uncle are Orthodox Christians, and they celebrate Easter on a slightly different calendar. So that's
Mhm.
next week. So I'll spend most of the week with them, participating in their Holy Week um, traditions, which are really lovely. It's some of my favorite things to do. So
That's wonderful.
yeah, it's really sweet for me,
Yeah.
and a joy and a privilege. Um, we recognize that not everyone has a chance to do that and might be feeling quite overwhelmed with responsibilities for planning services this week. So we hope that as we continue to have this conversation on air, that you find it helpful and encouraging and useful as you plan and prepare for what can be a hectic season for pastors.
Yeah. Well, as we prepare for that, would you speak for us a little bit towards communion and how it's reflected maybe in Good Friday, and maybe some more of the insights there on what it's like to have a celebration with communion?
Yeah, I've been thinking and reading a lot about the Eucharist. Uh, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, communion are always that we talk about this sacrament, but Eucharist specifically means thanksgiving, or something for which we give thanks. It comes from that the words of institution where Jesus takes a loaf of bread and give thanks for it, passes it around the table, takes a cup, gives thanks for it, and passes it around the table. Um, it's one of the ways that Jesus celebrates the last moments of his life. Like,
Mhm.
what are you going to do? You know that this is it. And he gathers his friends for a feast. Um, anyway, as I've read and studied a bit, and then participated in a local dinner church, a supper church, that takes communion as part of our weekly meal together. I've really learned that the early church, as they gathered around for meals, celebrated communion like a celebration with thanksgiving and festivity, an atmosphere of joy and again celebration. It was a party, with all that entails.
Mhm.
um, and that happened every week. It was like a party around the table, something full of this atmosphere of joy and thanksgiving. um, the one exception would have been Good Friday, or the time in the church's life where they remembered Jesus's betrayal, his death, and this would have been the one time of the year where it felt really somber and
Mhm.
serious, quiet and sober and reflective, versus like celebratory and joyful and thankful. But it seems to me, at least as I reflect on my nearly 30 years of experience in the church, that for the most part, when I've received communion in church, it almost always feels somber and
Mhm.
serious and like confess your sins, don't receive the cup unworthily. And even like pastor's body language and tone of voice says like, this is a serious thing on the
Mhm.
night our Lord was betrayed. And it just,
Yeah.
right, yeah. So I wish that I could in this moment remind people, in the midst of all of this like festive joy, when you receive the sacrament of communion, remember that it's also a little bit serious
Mhm.
on Good Friday.
Yeah.
I feel like it's what's maybe needed, at least again as I think about my personal experience in the Western Protestant church, is to say like, you seem to understand that communion has this serious and sober element, but have you remembered that it's joyful, that it's something
Mhm.
for which we give thanks?
Yeah. Especially on the day we celebrate the Lord's resurrection, receiving communion should be a celebration with your friends around the table. Something that really inspired me about what you said. That's really good.
Yeah, thanks for indulging me. That's a pet hobby of mine at the moment. So I've been reading a lot about that, and it does really seem to me that like Holy Week is this opportunity in the Christian calendar that creates space to like really step into the darkness of the story for a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I also wonder like maybe we've got that down. Maybe
Yeah.
we um we need to hear the invitation uh to celebrate
Mhm.
that as well. I
Amen.
don't
That's
know.
great.
Yeah,
Great. Something to think about for sure.
definitely. Well, speaking of like leaning into Easter Sunday and resurrection, let's pick up our text for this week. We've been working through the Gospel of Luke, so we'll read the resurrection narrative from Luke chapter 24. I'm reading from the CEB today. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, the women went to the tomb, bringing the fragrant spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but they went in. They didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. They didn't know what to make of this, and suddenly 2 men were standing beside them in gleaming bright clothing. The women were frightened and bowed their faces toward the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He isn't here, but has been raised. Remember what he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the human one must be handed over to sinners, be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words. When they returned from the tomb, they reported all these things to the 11 and all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. Their words struck the apostles as nonsense, and they didn't believe the women. But Peter ran to the tomb. When he bent over to look inside, he saw only the linen cloth. Then he returned home, wondering what had happened.
Mm.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right, where should we start, Ben? What sticks out to you? What's really calling your attention for this week?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. Some are better than others. Some are more living than dead. Just
Mm.
but I think in the themes of Luke that we've been looking through, I think one of the bigger things that strike me about this resurrection account is how it really reflects back to Christ's transfiguration. We see this powerful moment on the mountain where three of the disciples are there, including Peter, and we see two figures appear, Elijah and Moses, and then Peter asks for this. We should build a booth here to, kind of stay up here, and Jesus leads the disciples back down the mountain to where the work of God is happening. And so we see this incredible point in which Jesus was glorified, and then we see the full revelation of God's glory in the resurrection. And so these two figures are here, and we see Peter's empty booth, like the tomb, which is this memorial or memory of the dead, this physical built structure to memorialize and remember who this person was, their great life. Some tombs would have an inscription of some of their great things, like what we have with tombstones today. So it's literally this physical booth or memorial for this person, and it ends with Peter going back and like, man, the Jesus isn't really about booths, like staying still at all. Like Jesus is again out, and these two figures are pointing again, saying, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" And so that's one theme that really sticks out to me first. That there's a lot of other things that seem to be
Totally.
pointed at here as well.
I think it's like pretty obvious to say that the resurrection, like the empty tomb, is full of all of these callbacks to previous
Hmm.
points in the
Right,
story,
right,
right? If it's this whisper, this aside, like if you've been paying attention, this shouldn't surprise you.
right.
Like, and you mentioned before we went live that we could trace these callbacks, these touch points, like all the way back to the garden
Hmm.
story, right?
Yeah, right.
That this moment has been the thing that the whole story has been leading to. And so
Hmm.
of course it's going to have these layers upon layers of like echoes of other bits of the story, right?
Right.
The things that Jesus has said, the way that Jesus has responded to the world. the things that he's commissioned his disciples to do, who he's called them to be. All of that is like wrapped up in these few verses of text, has been like built in the story. As we've been moving through it.
Absolutely. So one of the things maybe we should be thankful for as preachers is that we get a short passage, but it's jam-packed of all these callbacks that could take, a whole sermon in and of themselves to harken back to just in Luke or the whole biblical story of God with humanity.
Right. And maybe the things that our congregations should be thankful for is that we preachers don't need to say everything.
Right.
Right.
Amen.
Like maybe just thinking through like what, as we've prayerfully, faithfully journeyed with Jesus through the wilderness, along the road into Jerusalem, through the passion and through the cross, like sitting in the silence of the grave and coming into Easter Sunday. Like what is the thing at this moment that kind of sparkles up to us or comes to us that like the one thing that we really maybe want our people to be thinking about, or maybe even that's too far to go just yet, but like maybe what is God saying to us as we encounter a familiar story, one that again, as pastors, as like longtime followers of Jesus, we've circled around these stories for a long time. They're foundational to our identity, and I guess I personally feel the pressure to say everything there is to say,
Right.
and I need to give myself permission to let that be, and to just say like, what is God saying to me today, this week. And some of the things that are really kind of shining up at me or calling my attention is this phrase that we read in the passage. Why do you look for the living among the dead? I've been thinking about like what it means for these women to have prepared spices and ointments to go and anoint the body for burial. They're prepared to grieve the death of their friend. They're prepared to grieve the death of their teacher. They're prepared, I think, to even grieve the death of their life together, so to speak. Like Jesus has been the one that they've been following. They thought he was going to be, I don't even know. But then he died. And so then what does that mean for everything that they have done in the past few years? They've left their lives behind. They've traveled with him on the road. They've seen his like mighty deeds of power, of love, of like they've seen him change the world as they know it. And then they also saw him die. And so I imagine them, they're prepared to grieve the loss of all of those things, and they show up to the graveyard, to the tomb, to do the right thing, to anoint the body for burial, to kind of lay it to rest. Maybe this is a little bit melodramatic to say, but maybe even to lay to rest their hopes and dreams, or like I don't know. It just seems like it's this really heavy moment. They're coming to go through the motions, to begin the process of grief. Like they're ready and prepared to accept this death, right? And they come looking for the body in the tomb, and it's not there, and they're flabbergasted. They're like shocked and surprised, and like they just can't quite compute with like what the messengers are saying, that like, why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. And then some of you might be using the John passage for the Easter lection if you're not using Luke. I just find it really interesting that we've got Mary Magdalene in that narrative showing up. She's looking for the body, and she keeps asking, where's the body? Where's the body? Like, what have they done with the body? Like, that's all that she can kind of wrap her head around, is like, she saw Jesus die. She saw them put his body into the tomb, and she's come to do the right thing in anointing the body for a decent and proper burial. And yet it's not there, and she's like face to face with the resurrected Jesus and doesn't even recognize him, and like can't quite get her head around like that there could be something else to the story. So I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about those sort of themes of like how many times do we show up prepared to welcome death or like do the right thing in terms of grieving the loss of something that
Hmm.
yeah, the loss of hopes, or like how many times do we show up prepared to reckon with death but not quite prepared for the possibility of resurrection.
Right.
um, and yeah, and then what does that mean? And I don't know, do you have some thoughts about that?
Oh, I mean, it's you just framed it so well. I think any sort of additions there would be, when death has the last word in our minds, when we truly deeply believe that, all we're left is memorializing what we thought could be. And so
Mm,
we prepare ourselves to then, bring, the metaphorical spices and things of caring and tending for the reality of death. Like,
mm,
let's make this smell as best we can. Let's tend to it and memorialize it as best we can to remember the past, because that's where life is now. It's in the past. Death has had the final say now. Whereas
mm,
living a life built on resurrection then doesn't stop with memorializing. We remember all of the incredible things, and this, in light of the incredible power of God that brought Christ back to life, we now have hope in the future. And
mm,
so in our grief, and it doesn't mean we don't grieve, the tragedies that happen, but in our grief, we're not as a church, in the function of just memorializing what God has done. We really like to stay in what the ways that have always been done in light of God. But how are we now looking where God is at work now today because of what God has done through the resurrection of Christ?
mm.
Um, Rather than memorializing, how are we resurrecting? Like, how are we moving through the world with Christ?
Yeah, I love that. How often do we show up but offering only like palliative care? Like,
mm,
we'll just put a band-aid on it, or like the best we can do is help you not be in so much pain, or you know what I mean?
yeah.
Like a sort of hospice kind of care, um, to the areas in our life and in our ministry that seem dead or dying. Like how
Mhm.
often do we show up with that kind of practical, like we'll meet the needs where we are, we'll do our best to kind of bandage it up and anoint it with some spices, but that's really all we can do,
Mhm.
rather than thinking like God is at work resurrecting the world. And what does that mean then for the way that we show up, to those places that feel like they're dead or dying?
Yeah, that's so good. Because then, like, how does it shape our relationships with one another?
Mm,
In that palliative care, in contrast to um, living into the reality of new life
hmm.
with Christ.
Yeah, yeah. I've been thinking a lot about that.
It's one of the things that sticks out to me in contrast to the garden narrative in Genesis. We see um, Eve bringing the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, handing it to Adam. There's no like argument. There's no dismissal from Adam. It's just this. Adam's kind of mute. You notice that he just doesn't really say anything in that account, and he receives the fruit. And then there's disjointed relationship between Adam and Eve and humanity and really the mother of life, if we take the meanings of their names in their true metaphorical sense. Adamaha, all of humanity. Eve is the mother or the birthplace of all of life in the world. And so like then there's tension between those two figures. And here that's the grand reversal. The resurrection of Christ brings back the intended order that God had
Mm,
in Genesis. And the women bring the first fruit of the resurrection of Christ to the disciples, to the men who still function in this kind of broken world order where they're dismissive. They don't really take the account seriously, and Peter has to go see for himself. He's like there's that kind of this unwillingness to receive this fruit, and so for me at least, where I want to go with that is that their minds and their imaginations and their expectations are still in memorializing or living into the old world order that is ruled by death, uh,
Mm.
that puts tension and animosity between, male and female, the genders, all the races, whether, the caste of society, all those things that we have placed barriers between each other is markers of the old world that is dominated by sin and death, where the church is now called to live into the light of the resurrection, and we don't have those tensions or animosities anymore. We
Mm.
receive each other in the light of Christ's resurrection. We
Yeah,
listen to each other in the light of the resurrection. We don't take each other for granted because we know who created and through who all was created, um,
yeah,
in
yeah.
Christ. So that's kind of where my
Amen.
mind goes with that as well.
Yeah, I love that. But also we see in the story folks like healed in stages, so to speak. Like
Yeah,
remember the parable of Jesus healing a blind man who sort of step one he sees trees
yeah,
walking around or like figures that just look like trees, and then step two is like he can fully see again. Um and in context of that narrative, it's really meant to spotlight the growing understanding of the disciples, like as they're like stepping into this understanding of a new reality, having their minds and imaginations and hearts shaped by something really different. And
mhm,
so like here in the resurrection narratives, we see the women come and give this report, and then like so Luke, it's Peter who runs to the tomb, and then in John, we're meant to assume, I think it's John who runs there, and then they see like the empty tomb and then the linen that's there, and it says like they believed the report of the women, but the ambiguity is there that like maybe they just believe what they said, that the tomb was empty. There
mm,
isn't quite yet like because there's follow-up stories about Jesus appearing to the disciples, and then Jesus appearing to the group with Thomas, where he says like, I'm not going to believe until I can touch the wounds, and some of these other things where so maybe the women come and give this report like the tomb is empty, Christ is risen, and they're like, I don't know about that. And so then they run to the tomb and they're like, okay, well maybe the tomb is empty, but what does that mean?
right,
And then
right.
and then there's encounters with the risen Christ. So all of that to say that there's I think like this I yeah, this the narratives provide space for, oh my gosh, the bumbling disciples to
Mhm,
continue to like grow in their understanding and in their faith, until, I mean, especially if we're moving through like Luke and then into Acts, we see them really fully transformed, and really receiving the commission of Christ, and then really leaning into that resurrection mentality. I guess what I'm trying to say is like I just don't see them get there overnight. You know what I mean? Like
right,
it isn't just suddenly the women come and they believe the women and suddenly um,
right.
everything is new. Like they're even post resurrection, there's this journey toward faithfulness for the
Mm.
disciples, and so that's intriguing to me.
Yeah, and there's that theme is definitely present in the last few verses of the Luke passage. That the divine one said, um, "Don't you remember what he told you while he was still in Galilee? The human one must be handed over to sinners, be crucified, and on the third day rise again." And then verse 8, then they remembered his words.
Mm-hmm.
So this they didn't understand, they were perplexed. Then through the proclamation of remember what Jesus said, then they understood, then they remembered. And so there is this journey of like proclamation and understanding, and this continued like, thank goodness, well, thank God that God is a God of reminders. Like, do
Mm-hmm.
you remember, like, do you remember how we did this though? Like, do you remember how I said that I was gonna, be handed over and rise from the dead? And in that connection of this journey of healing, God is also reminding us, like, this is where we're supposed to be found in this journey. And
Mm-hmm.
God is faithful to remind us as well. I think that's the task of the church as well, in light of the resurrection, that we are ones who are never grow impatient at reminding each other of the value that God has for us and how God will continue to to value us, and the resurrection is the deepest example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's so good. Man, I just feel like there's so much here.
Oh
We've
yeah,
barely scratched the surface,
really, yeah.
but yeah, that coming into Easter, this is our opportunity to tell the whole story of God, to tell the story of Jesus Christ, to journey with Jesus through the last days of his life, to sit in the silence of Holy Saturday, to welcome the news of the resurrection. Are there any like parting thoughts or comments or other maybe homiletical handles that you want to offer to our listeners?
I think I'll just say the challenge that I've had on my own heart is to, even though, ministry can be full of responsibilities this week, to do my best to stop, reflect, and, as you said, engage in following Christ to the cross, to the tomb, and then into the resurrection in a faithful, reflective way, that I can really draw myself to Christ, and that then I can maybe be shaped in helping that process or that journey for others this week.
That's really good. Yeah. Similarly, I'm praying to cultivate an attitude of humility that I may receive the Christ who comes exactly the way that Christ comes
Yeah.
without expecting it to be a certain way, or um, I don't want to be looking for the living among the dead. I want to
Mhm.
be ready to receive the resurrected Christ and all that that means. So
Amen.
praying
Amen.
for the humility and attentiveness and grace to do that kind of work. Um,
I appreciate your insights on this text and the themes of resurrection in general today, Alicia.
yeah, thanks, Ben. Similarly, it's always a privilege to open the scriptures together, and we hope also that it's helpful for our listeners. We love your feedback, so if you have some thoughts or if there's some other connections that you're making between these texts and other lectionary texts, let us know. Let us know where you're headed after Easter and how we can continue to make this a helpful resource. Check out the commentaries on the website. As always, follow us on all the social media platforms. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.